The people who can change a room the fastest are usually the ones nobody notices until it's too late to misunderstand them. Friday nights at Murphy's Landing always followed the same rhythm in Cedar Point, Oregon. The televisions above the bar played baseball highlights on mute, while country music drifted through conversations about fishing trips, overtime shifts, and high school football scores. Neon signs reflected against polished wood, servers balanced trays of burgers and fries, and regulars occupied their usual stools as if assigned by invisible contracts written years ago. It was the kind of place where everyone knew who belonged and who didn't. So when Claire Donovan walked through the front door a little after 7:30, heads turned for reasons nobody could quite explain. She wasn't dressed to impress. A gray jacket rested over a plain navy t-shirt, faded jeans, and practical boots that had seen more miles than fashion catalogs would recommend. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a low ponytail, and there wasn't a trace of makeup meant to demand attention. She looked like someone who had driven home from a long shift and decided she didn't want to spend another evening listening to the silence of her own living room. Yet there was something unusual about the way she paused just inside the entrance. Her eyes moved once across the room without lingering on anyone. Front door, emergency exit, kitchen entrance, restrooms, back hallway, windows. Then she chose a seat with her back near the wall and a clear view of every possible exit. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Claire doubted anyone ever did. The bartender, a broad-shouldered man named Pete who had worked Murphy's Landing for almost 20 years, approached with the relaxed friendliness small towns perfected over generations. "First time here?" he asked while wiping down the counter. Claire offered a small smile. "Passing through," she said. Her voice carried no sharp edges, no invitation for more questions. Pete nodded toward the menu. "Best clam chowder in town. At least that's what we tell tourists." A faint hint of amusement touched Claire's expression. "Then I'd better try it." She ordered chowder, iced tea, and nothing stronger. While conversation swirled around her, she sat quietly with both hands resting near her glass, listening more than speaking. Across the room, laughter erupted from a table occupied by a group of men celebrating the end of another workweek. Their voices carried over music and clinking glasses. One of them glanced toward the woman sitting alone at the bar and smirked before leaning closer to his friends. Pete noticed it immediately. So did an older customer nursing black coffee in the corner booth. Claire, meanwhile, lifted her spoon, thanked Pete when her meal arrived, and kept her attention on the simple comfort of hot chowder on a rainy Oregon evening. To everyone watching, she looked exactly like what they assumed she was: quiet, ordinary, forgettable. And in Murphy's Landing, that assumption was about to become the biggest mistake anyone in the room would make. Claire Donovan had mastered the art of becoming background noise long before she ever stepped into Murphy's Landing. She ate slowly, not because she was distracted, but because she never rushed moments that allowed her to observe. The chowder steamed gently beneath the warm bar lights while rain tapped against the windows overlooking the parking lot. Around her, conversations shifted naturally from local gossip to sports scores and weekend plans. Someone argued about whether the Mariners finally had a chance this season. A couple near the jukebox debated vacation destinations they could not quite afford. Two off-duty nurses laughed over stories from their shifts at the county hospital. Life moved forward exactly as it always had, and Claire seemed content to let it flow around her unnoticed. Yet small habits betrayed a discipline most civilians never developed. When a server accidentally dropped a tray near the kitchen entrance, Claire's head turned before anyone else reacted. When the front door opened, she glanced toward it instinctively without interrupting her meal. When Pete reached under the register for fresh receipt paper, she had already identified the movement from the corner of her eye before returning her attention to her iced tea. She never appeared tense. If anything, she looked remarkably relaxed. But there was a difference between relaxation and awareness, and the distinction lived quietly beneath everything she did. The older man seated in the corner booth continued watching her over the rim of his coffee mug. His silver hair and weathered face suggested decades spent working outdoors or carrying responsibilities heavier than most people recognized. Twice, he seemed ready to say something before changing his mind. Pete eventually leaned closer while refilling Claire's glass. "You really passing through?" he asked casually. Claire looked toward the rain outside before answering. "That was the plan." Pete chuckled. Something tells me plans change. For the first time, her smile reached her eyes, though only briefly. Sometimes they do. Across the room, the group celebrating another successful workweek had grown louder. Their confidence expanded with every fresh round of drinks and exaggerated stories. One man insisted he could still outrun anyone from his high school football team. Another claimed he once talked his way out of 3 speeding tickets in 1 month. Their laughter rolled through the room with the careless certainty of people convinced the evening belonged to them. Eventually, attention drifted back toward the woman sitting alone at the bar. "She has not looked up from that soup in 20 minutes," one of them remarked. "Maybe she is writing a mystery novel in her head," another joked. "Or waiting for someone who stood her up," someone added, drawing more laughter. Pete shot them a warning glance that went ignored. Claire gave no indication she had heard any of it. Instead, she folded her napkin neatly beside her bowl and thanked Pete when he brought a fresh lemon wedge for her tea. The older man in the corner noticed something else then. Claire's right hand rested loosely near her glass, while her left adjusted the cuff of her jacket just enough to reveal a faded tan line circling her wrist where a watch had once spent years in exactly the same place. Tiny details. Easy to miss. But sometimes a person's smallest habits whispered truths louder than words ever could. And somewhere deep beneath Murphy's Landing's ordinary Friday night atmosphere, the quiet pressure in the room had begun to shift. The rain outside intensified, turning the parking lot into a blur of reflected neon and shimmering headlights. Inside Murphy's Landing, however, the warmth of routine continued to shelter everyone from the storm beyond the windows. Pete polished glasses behind the bar, while country music shifted into an older song about heartbreak and home. Claire Donovan glanced at the clock mounted above the liquor shelves. 7:53. Not because she was impatient, but because old habits measured time differently. In another life, minutes had meant fuel levels, changing conditions, and windows that opened and closed without warning. Now they simply marked the passing of another Friday evening in a small Oregon town. She finished the last spoonful of chowder and slid the bowl slightly forward with quiet appreciation. "Best clam chowder in town," she asked Pete. "You might not be exaggerating." Pete grinned proudly. "Do not let the other places hear you say that." Claire nodded. "Your secret is safe." The exchange lasted only seconds, yet it reminded Pete of something he could not quite explain. Most travelers either want a conversation or complete isolation. Claire existed somewhere in between. She answered when spoken to, listened carefully, and offered kindness without encouraging familiarity. It was the kind of self-containment that intrigued people who had spent their lives surrounded by noise. Across the room, the group of men had exhausted sports debates and exaggerated work stories. Restlessness settled over their table like static before a summer storm. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Travis who had become increasingly eager to entertain his friends, leaned back in his chair and glanced again toward the quiet woman at the bar. "I am telling you," he said with a laugh. "She has not looked up all night." Another shrugged. "Maybe she is waiting for somebody." "Maybe nobody showed up," someone suggested. That would explain the mysterious attitude. Their comments were not especially cruel by the standards of crowded bars and overconfident weekends. They were careless in the way people often became when they forgot strangers carried histories beyond first impressions. Pete looked up from drying a glass. "How about you gentlemen focus on your own table?" he called out evenly. Travis raised both hands in mock surrender. "Just making conversation, Pete." The older man in the corner booth lowered his coffee cup once more. His gaze moved between Travis and Claire before settling briefly on Claire's posture. Still relaxed, still composed. She folded her receipt carefully and tucked it beneath the edge of her empty bowl. She thanked Pete when he refreshed her tea without asking. She even offered a quiet apology when another customer accidentally brushed past her stool carrying a tray of appetizers. Not once did irritation cross her face. Yet the older man noticed her eyes flick toward the reflection in the mirror behind the bottles. One glance, one calculation, then gone. Travis pushed back from his table to scattered encouragement from his friends. "I am going to see if Mystery Woman actually talks," he announced with a grin that suggested he expected applause. Pete's expression tightened immediately. "Leave her alone, Travis." "Relax," Travis replied. "I am just being friendly." The older man set down his coffee with deliberate care. Around them, Conversations continued, unaware that ordinary evenings rarely announced the exact moment they began changing forever. Claire reached for her glass of iced tea as footsteps approached behind her, her expression calm and unreadable, while somewhere beneath the steady rhythm of rain against the windows, the atmosphere inside Murphy's Landing shifted into something quieter and infinitely more serious. Travis stopped beside Claire's stool wearing the easy confidence of a man who had never questioned whether a room belonged to him. Up close, he smelled faintly of beer and cedar aftershave, his smile broad enough to earn approval from the friends watching from across the room. "You know," he began, resting one hand lightly against the polished bar top, "most people come here to have a little fun." Claire looked up at him for the first time that evening. Her expression remained neutral, almost kind. "I am having a nice evening," she replied. "Thank you." Her answer was polite, direct, and offered no invitation beyond basic courtesy. Travis chuckled as if she had misunderstood the rules of an unspoken game. "Come on," he said. "You have been sitting here all night by yourself. At least let me buy you another drink." Claire glanced down at her nearly full glass of iced tea before meeting his eyes again. "I appreciate the offer, but I am fine." Pete immediately seized the opportunity to redirect the situation. "Travis," he called from behind the counter, "your friends are waiting on you." For a moment, it appeared the evening might return to normal. Travis hesitated, shrugged, and took half a step backward. Then laughter drifted over from his table. Someone raised an eyebrow. Someone else muttered something about striking out. The harmless sting of embarrassment settled visibly across his face. He turned back toward Claire with renewed determination disguised as charm. "You do not have to be so serious," he said. "I am just trying to be friendly." Claire folded her hands neatly around her glass. "And I am asking politely to enjoy the rest of my meal in peace." The older man in the corner booth lowered his gaze briefly before looking back toward them. Pete stopped wiping the same glass he had been polishing for the last 30 seconds. Nearby conversations softened, not because anyone expected trouble, but because people instinctively sensed tension before they understood its source. Travis exhaled through his nose and forced another laugh. "You always this guarded?" Claire considered the question with the same thoughtfulness she had brought to everything else that evening. "I think everyone earns the right to choose who has access to their time," she answered quietly. The response should have ended the exchange. It was reasonable, respectful, and impossible to argue against without exposing one's own immaturity. But pride often demanded an audience. Travis glanced back toward his friends, aware of their attention and unwilling to return empty-handed. "You know," he said, "most people around here know how to hold a conversation." Claire pushed her empty bowl slightly farther away and reached for her wallet. "Then I hope you find someone who enjoys having one with you." Pete stepped forward. "Travis, that is enough." Rain rattled harder against the windows. The older man in the corner slowly stood from his booth without saying a word. Claire placed cash beneath her receipt and adjusted the sleeve of her gray jacket. There was no irritation in her movements, no visible frustration, only the calm efficiency of someone preparing to leave. She slid carefully off the stool and offered Pete a small smile. "Thank you for dinner," she said. Then she turned toward the exit just as Travis shifted sideways, unintentionally placing himself between her and the front door. Around them, Murphy's Landing grew unexpectedly quiet, as though the entire room had paused to see whether kindness would still be enough to carry everyone safely through the rest of the evening. Claire stopped when she realized the path to the exit had narrowed, not blocked in any obvious sense, but complicated by pride, misunderstanding, and the uncomfortable energy that spreads through crowded places when people stop listening to one another. Travis raised both hands in a gesture meant to appear harmless. "Hey," he said, forcing another smile. "I think this whole thing got blown out of proportion." Claire regarded him calmly. "Then let us not make it bigger." Her voice remained steady and low enough that people closest to them leaned in to hear. Pete had already moved around the end of the counter, careful not to escalate what still looked like an awkward misunderstanding rather than genuine conflict. "Travis," he warned quietly, "take your seat." The older man who had risen from the corner booth now stood several feet away, his weathered expression unreadable. Travis hesitated. The room waited. Outside, rainwater streamed down the windows in silver ribbons beneath the glow of the parking lot lights. "You know what?" Travis said at last, his embarrassment showing through the edges of forced humor. Forget it. Relief moved through Murphy's Landing like a collective exhale. One of his friends called out awkwardly for him to come back to the table. Pete slowed his approach. Claire shifted her attention toward the front door once more. Then, in the confusion of too many emotions colliding at once, someone bumped into someone else near the crowded aisle between tables. A tray tilted. Glasses clinked sharply. Chairs scraped against the floor. Startled reactions echoed through the room as people instinctively turned toward the sudden commotion. Claire moved before anyone realized she had moved at all. A server stumbling under the weight of a falling tray regained her balance when Claire steadied the edge of the load with one hand while guiding a frightened customer out of the way with the other. It was over in seconds. No dramatic gestures. No panic. The tray remained upright. The server blinked in surprise. "Thank you," she whispered breathlessly. Claire offered a small nod. "You are welcome." But the older man had seen something the rest of the room had not. It was not what she did. It was how she did it. The precision. The economy of movement. The way she remained aware of multiple people simultaneously without appearing rushed. The absence of hesitation. The complete control. His expression changed almost imperceptibly as memories surfaced from places he rarely visited anymore. Young men standing shoulder to shoulder beneath impossible skies. Briefings delivered in quiet voices. Professionals who solved problems before others recognized danger existed. Pete noticed the older man's reaction. "You all right, Frank?" he asked softly. Frank did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Claire as she thanked Pete once more and adjusted the strap of her worn shoulder bag. Around them, conversations slowly resumed, though not with the same ease as before. Something invisible had shifted. Travis stood awkwardly near his table, no longer the center of attention he had hoped to become. Claire reached for the door handle, prepared to disappear back into the rainy Oregon night exactly as quietly as she had arrived. Then Frank finally spoke, his voice carrying just enough weight to silence the nearest conversations without effort. "Excuse me," he said carefully. Claire paused and looked back toward him. Frank studied her face for a long moment before asking the question that had suddenly transformed Murphy's Landing from an ordinary small-town bar into a room holding its breath. "Where did you learn to move like that?" The question settled over Murphy's Landing with surprising weight. Conversations that had only just resumed softened again into scattered whispers and curious glances. Claire Donovan remained near the front door with one hand resting lightly against the strap of her shoulder bag. Rain continued tracing slow paths down the windows behind her, and somewhere near the jukebox, an old country song faded into silence before another took its place. Frank took a cautious step forward, his weathered face marked by equal parts uncertainty and recognition. "I have seen that before," he said quietly. "The way you watch a room. The way you react before everyone else understands what is happening." Claire held his gaze without discomfort or defensiveness. "I think life teaches people different things," she answered. Frank shook his head. "Not like that." Pete looked between them, suddenly aware that the older man who had spent years drinking black coffee in the same corner booth sounded different tonight. More serious. More careful. Frank folded his hands together as if organizing memories that had not been touched in decades. "I served in the Navy," he said. "A long time ago." The room seemed to contract around those words. Travis and his friends exchanged uncertain glances. The nurses by the jukebox stopped pretending not to listen. Frank's eyes never left Claire's face. "I worked with people who moved exactly the way you do," he continued. "They never wasted energy, never drew attention to themselves. They noticed exits before menus. They listened more than they spoke." Claire lowered her eyes briefly before looking back at him. "That was a long time ago for me too." Frank's expression tightened. "For you?" Silence followed. It lasted only a few seconds, but it carried years within it. Claire glanced toward the rain outside, as if considering how much truth belonged to strangers sharing one evening in a small-town bar. Finally, she answered in the same calm voice she had used all night. "People change," she said softly. "They leave careers behind. They start over." Frank's jaw shifted as realization moved through him piece by piece. "Not all careers," he replied. "Some become part of who you are." Claire said nothing. Pete noticed the tiny shift in her posture. Not fear, not discomfort, acceptance. Frank took another breath. "Were you Navy?" he asked carefully. Claire's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the strap of her bag before relaxing again. Once, she said. Travis frowned in confusion. Wait, like stationed somewhere. Frank looked at him with an expression somewhere between disbelief and restraint. No, he said quietly. Not just stationed somewhere. He turned back toward Claire, his voice rougher now. Tell me I am wrong. Claire met his eyes. The room waited. The rain kept falling. You are asking questions that stopped mattering a long time ago, she said. Frank's eyes glistened beneath the bar lights. Maybe they stopped mattering to the people who wrote reports, he replied. But not to the people who remember. He straightened slowly, decades of old respect resurfacing through muscle memory older than reason itself. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper that somehow carried through every corner of Murphy's Landing, he said, Ma'am, were you a Navy SEAL? No one laughed. No one reached for another drink. Claire stood quietly beneath the glow of the neon signs, rain shadowing the glass behind her, while the entire room waited for the answer from the woman they had mistaken for ordinary. Claire did not answer immediately. The silence that followed Frank's question felt different from the awkward pauses that had filled Murphy's Landing earlier that evening. This silence carried respect, uncertainty, and the sudden realization that every assumption in the room might have been wrong. Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward the worn strap of her shoulder bag before lifting them again. I wore a uniform once, she said softly. That is enough for tonight. Frank's expression shifted into something almost painful. He nodded slowly, as though confirming an answer he had already known in his heart. People like you always say that, he murmured. You make it sound small. Pete looked from Frank to Claire. You really served? He asked carefully. Claire offered the slightest nod. A long time ago. Travis stared at her in disbelief. But you do not look like. He stopped himself, embarrassed by the sentence he had nearly finished. Claire spared him the discomfort of explaining. Most people do not, she replied gently. The older nurses near the jukebox exchanged glances. One of them finally spoke. My brother came home from Iraq and never talked about any of it, she said quietly. Maybe silence means something different after certain experiences. Claire's eyes softened. Sometimes it does. Frank remained standing. I remember a briefing years ago, he said, almost to himself. Someone told us the professionals we would never hear about were the ones carrying the heaviest stories. He looked back at Claire. I never understood that until later. Rain continued falling beyond the windows, steady and patient against the Oregon night. Murphy's Landing had become impossibly still. Nobody checked scores on the televisions anymore. Nobody joked about football or overtime shifts. They listened instead to a woman who had spent the entire evening trying not to become the center of attention. Claire took a slow breath. People think service is about medals, she said, or headlines, or being called a hero. Her voice remained calm, but something older moved beneath it now. Most of the time it is about showing up for the people beside you, doing your job, hoping everyone makes it home. Frank's gaze lowered. Did they? He asked. For the first time that evening, Claire hesitated. The neon lights reflected softly against the windows behind her. Not always, she answered. Nobody rushed to fill the silence after that. Travis lowered his eyes toward the floor. Pete set down the glass he had unconsciously been holding for several minutes. Even the regulars who had never met Claire understood that some losses remained too sacred for strangers to examine. Frank swallowed hard before speaking again. I am sorry, he said. Claire offered him a small, grateful smile. Thank you. She adjusted her jacket as if preparing once more to leave. The people I served with would hate this conversation, she admitted. A faint trace of humor touched her expression. They believed the mission mattered more than the recognition. Frank surprised her by smiling back. Then maybe they were lucky to have someone who still remembers them. Claire's composure wavered for only a heartbeat before settling once again into quiet steadiness. Every day, she said. I remember them every day. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the coastline. Inside Murphy's Landing, nobody saw an extraordinary operator standing beneath the neon signs anymore. They saw something far more human. A woman carrying the memory of people she had loved, people she had lost, and a promise she had never stopped keeping long after the uniform had been folded away. For a long moment, nobody moved toward the familiar comfort of pretending the conversation had never happened. The televisions continued flashing silent highlights above the bar, and the rain maintained its steady rhythm against the glass. But Murphy's Landing no longer sounded like Murphy's Landing. The atmosphere had changed in a way nobody could quite describe. Claire Donovan stood near the entrance with her shoulder bag resting against her side, looking less like a legend and more like someone who had simply grown tired from carrying invisible weight for too many years. Pete finally broke the silence. I guess I always thought strength looked different, he admitted. Claire turned toward him. Most people do, she said. We are taught to recognize loud confidence. Big personalities. People who make sure everyone notices them. Pete nodded slowly. And that is not real strength. Claire considered the question carefully before answering. Sometimes it is, she replied. But the strongest people I ever knew were not interested in proving anything. They showed up early. They did their jobs. They looked after the people around them. Then they went home without asking for applause. Frank smiled sadly. The ones who carried others through hard days rarely talked about it afterward. Claire met his gaze. Because it was never about being admired. Travis shifted awkwardly near his table before finally finding the courage to speak. I judged you the second I saw you sitting here alone, he admitted. I thought quiet meant weak. I thought ordinary meant unimportant. Claire's expression softened. You are not the first person to think that, she said. And you will not be the last. Travis looked down at his hands. I am sorry. The apology hung in the air, imperfect but sincere. Claire offered him a small nod. Thank you. One of the nurses near the jukebox crossed her arms thoughtfully. I spend 12-hour shifts surrounded by people fighting battles nobody else can see, she said. Maybe we all underestimate each other more than we realize. Claire smiled faintly. Everyone is carrying something, she answered. Fear, grief, responsibility, exhaustion. We just do not always know what it is. Frank glanced around the room at the familiar faces he had known for years. Funny thing is, he said quietly, we spend so much time teaching people how to stand out that we forget to teach them how to pay attention. Claire looked toward the rain outside before speaking again. The people who changed my life were rarely the loudest people in the room, she said. They were the ones who noticed when someone needed help. The ones who stayed calm when others panicked. The ones who treated strangers with dignity because they understood how quickly life can humble anyone. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody checked their phones. Murphy's Landing listened. Respect should not begin after someone proves they deserve it, Claire continued. It should begin with the understanding that every person you meet has a story you cannot see. Pete let out a quiet breath. That might be the hardest lesson of all. Claire adjusted the strap of her bag and glanced once more toward the front door. Maybe, she said gently, but it is worth learning. Outside, the storm showed no signs of stopping. Inside, beneath the soft glow of neon lights and the scent of coffee and chowder lingering in the air, a room full of ordinary people sat with an extraordinary realization. The most dangerous assumption they had made that night was not that a quiet woman could not carry remarkable experiences. It was believing that kindness, humility, and silence meant there was nothing important left to discover. Claire reached for the door handle once more, and this time nobody tried to stop her. The rain outside had softened into a steady mist that blurred the parking lot lights into watercolor reflections across the pavement. Behind her, Murphy's Landing remained suspended in the strange quiet that follows moments people know they will remember long after they should have forgotten the details. Pete walked around the end of the counter carrying a small paper bag. You paid for dinner already, he said, extending it toward her. But nobody leaves this place without dessert when they survive one of my Friday nights. Claire looked down at the slice of homemade blackberry pie tucked carefully inside and let out the faintest laugh anyone had heard from her all evening. I do not think survival was ever in question, she replied. Pete smiled. Humor an old bartender. Claire accepted the bag with both hands. Thank you. Travis approached next, no trace of the swagger he had worn earlier. I meant what I said, he told her. About being sorry. Claire studied him for a moment before answering. Then let tonight teach you something useful. He nodded. It already has. Frank remained near his booth, shoulders slightly straighter than before. I spent years wondering whether people remembered the ones who never asked to be remembered, he said quietly. Now I think maybe they do. Claire's eyes softened. The best people I knew never measured their lives by recognition, she said. They measured them by whether they took care of the person standing next to them. Frank lowered his head briefly before lifting it again. Fair winds, Claire. The phrase settled between them with an understanding few others in the room fully grasped. Claire nodded once. Fair winds. She stepped outside beneath the cool Oregon night air, the scent of rain and pine filling her lungs as the door closed gently behind her. Through the windows of Murphy's Landing, people watched her cross the parking lot carrying nothing more than a shoulder bag and a paper sack containing blackberry pie. No escort arrived. No dramatic farewell unfolded beneath flashing lights. There were no speeches, no applause, and no declarations meant to transform her into something larger than life. She climbed into an aging pickup truck with more miles behind it than ahead of it, set the dessert carefully on the passenger seat, and paused with her hands resting lightly against the steering wheel. For just a moment, her gaze drifted toward the horizon hidden beyond the rain and darkness. Faces lived there. Voices. Promises. The people she still carried with her every single day. Then she started the engine and pulled away from Murphy's Landing as quietly as she had arrived. Inside the bar, conversations eventually returned, but they returned changed. Pete became more patient with difficult customers. Travis learned to think before deciding who deserved his respect. The nurses spoke more gently to frightened families. Frank ordered his usual black coffee and smiled whenever someone underestimated silence. And somewhere along the Oregon coast, a woman who had once worn a uniform continued building an ordinary life shaped by extraordinary memories, never asking to be admired and never explaining more than necessary. Because the truth was not that the strongest people hide who they are. The truth was that they no longer need the world to tell them who they have always been. Respect was never earned through volume. It lived in restraint, in service, in humility, and in the quiet decision to keep showing up for others long after nobody was watching. And sometimes, the people who raise the standard the highest are the ones who leave without waiting to hear the room fall silent behind them.